The Money Show.
Other people's money.
Tonight, the turn of Kumi Naidoo, the activist, the author. He has been Secretary General of Amnesty International, Executive Director of Greenpeace International. He's written a book, Letters to My Mother, The Making of a Troublemaker. We'll go to that book and why he wrote it and the lessons from that and the catalytic impact his mother's death had on his activism. But let's just do a quick catch-up, Kumi Naidoo. I mean, other than writing a book, are you retired? Are you activizing? I mean, what do activists do? Bring us up to speed with where you are right now.
Actually, I'm more busy than I've ever been.
Excellent.
I'm spending quite a lot of time advising the Community Arts Network, which is a global network, on what we're calling promoting artivism, which is bringing arts, culture, and activism together, recognizing that the biggest challenge we face in terms of moving the climate agenda forward, the economic justice agenda forward, and so on, is the fact that we cannot communicate the urgency of the challenges that we face to the large enough numbers of people fast enough, and so on. So artivism is one of the big things that I'm engaged in, but quite a lot of my work is volunteer-based at the moment, and putting quite a lot of effort with Louisa and Bianca in setting up the Rikirik Foundation for the promotion of artivism as well, and generally continuing to support the work of the climate movement globally, and generally continue to make trouble as best as I can.
But trouble's your middle name, isn't it? I mean, you've been looking to cause trouble with purpose, of course, for a very long time. Do you find the arts a more effective delivery mechanism for your message than perhaps going in rubber dinghies and boarding oil tankers and things like that? Or does every bit of activism have its different role to play?
Yeah, no, I think, different pieces have their different roles to play depending what the situation is. But I think one very important lesson we need to learn is that progressive activism generally tries to win their arguments by facts and figures. Like, say, in the climate movement, we're always talking about 1.5 degrees and 350 parts per million and so on. But actually, if you look at Steve Bannon and the right-wing forces that we see in the world today, they firstly don't use facts. They're very comfortable using lies. I'm not saying we should do that, but they forget about the head. They are aiming everything to the heart and to arouse passion and so on. And if you look at how people are moved, people are not necessarily moved by just facts and figures, though we should try to hold true to them at all times. But people are moved when the emotions are moved, when the sense of injustice is, aroused and so on. And I think right now we have to be thinking in a context where we're losing the fight on climate change and so on, that we have to be thinking about, if we are saying it cannot be business as usual and government as usual, we must also be saying it cannot be activism as usual.
I was going to get to that point as to whether activism works anymore. Activism, through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, activism, if you like, the boarding of the oil tankers, the people attaching themselves to buildings and all sorts of things like that, certainly got lots of attention. I wonder, with the gift of hindsight, as to whether you believe it did any good at all?
No, I think the purpose of each of those actions is to bear witness and to draw public attention to something that was happening. When I occupied an oil rig in Greenland in 2011, there was virtually no global public awareness around the centrality of what was happening to the Arctic for all of us around the world. And it was to start drawing attention to the fact that the Arctic is the air conditioner and refrigerator of the planet. The fact that during the summer months we see ice dropping to such low levels means that ice cannot take the harsh edge of the sun away from coming down onto the planet. And so in that sense, has a huge impact. And so that action began the global public conversation not that it wasn't there, but exploded it and got it going. So it served a particular purpose. But I think you cannot use the same tool for every situation all the time. And at some point, you have to recognize that activism cannot be only about winning over the people who largely agree with you, but also activism has to be about how do we win over the people that are not with us, and also to win over the people who are actively not with us, or actively against us. So in the United States, for example, on any progressive agenda, you can't win if you don't uh, seriously figure out a way of how you shift people, including a certain percentage of people that are in Trump's camp, away from
But
him
it's
into a more
so much harder, isn't it? I mean, in a social media world where the
it's not
greatest the weaponization of information has gone to it goes to the base level of human fear and human bias and human prejudice, and it plays on those emotions. It becomes very difficult to come and fight an emotional fight with facts only. And it becomes I think activism has been made that much more difficult in the 21st century via social media. It was supposed to be a tool that everybody could use, but it's actually been abused to such an extent. I don't know if it can be used for good, can it?
well. I think in the early stages of social media, actually, I would say progressive forces used it more effectively, whether it was on climate justice, gender justice, um, the global anti-poverty movement, and so on. But then we saw, I think right now, I would say that it would appear that it's causing more harm than good. But obviously, it's a reality, and people, I, we are all in that space and trying to make that space be as safe and as useful to and as honest as possible. But as you know, one of the casualties of the social media space has been truth in many ways. So it requires some very, very thoughtful, careful thinking and finding the right balance between sort of ensuring the freedom of what the space means is maintained to a good level, but also it has to have some measure of regulation. Otherwise, I think that the level of untruths and misinformation and disinformation that we have is just because today people can't distinguish between 702 and Cape Talk on the one hand, say, and somebody who has some public profile posting a long Facebook post.
No, and
And that's a dilemma.
it's a tragic. It is a tragedy, and we've got to work harder and harder and harder to distinguish between fact and fiction, because so often fiction dressed up as fact is a very appealing prospect for many people because it plays to their own prejudices. But you wrote a book, and you've written a book, I suppose, in a way, as an adult, to deal with the agony at the age of 15 of losing your mum. Your mum died by suicide. You found out from one of your younger siblings, and you've written this book, Letters to My Mother: The Making of a Troublemaker. This sort of seminal moment in your life, I guess.
Yes, for sure, and a catastrophic moment. And I always wanted to kind of have one long final conversation with my mom since she passed because I didn't have that chance.
No.
And for years, I've been thinking about it, and false starts, and various people helped me along the way. But I just didn't have the sort of emotional energy to do it. And then the untimely death of my sister in 2018 from cancer at the age of 56 was very, very close, and who had stepped into the role of mum after my mum passed, kind of gave me the sort of motivation again to think about it. And then I guess COVID, when it locked us down, also gave me for the first time some space to actually work on it. And so I have to say that I will strongly recommend to anybody who's going through trauma and grief to, even if you don't plan to publish, to actually put down your thoughts, because just I talked everything through on tape first to a large extent, and the process of just getting the story out was painful but very cathartic, and long overdue. In my case, I delayed it for 4 decades. I would recommend to people not to do the same.
No, exactly. I mean, and again, it's sort of pop psychology tells us you got to speak about it. You got to speak about it. It becomes very Hollywood and American. And actually, no, this I think a huge amount of truth in that particular message, because it set your family back hugely, I'm sure. I mean, you then start in political activism, you end up going into exile in the United Kingdom, and life for you kind of begins quite late, as it does with many activists, particularly anti-apartheid activists, because your life goes on hold for a period of time while you're fighting a much bigger fight than sort of setting yourself up as, school, university, get a job sort of thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, though, another way of looking at it is, well, not that life started late, but actually real life started
Maybe,
in a way
yeah,
that
true.
the the world we live in has been made that the norm is to, finish high school, get into university, get a job, and try and move up the ladder. And today we are finding that throughout the world, that sort of trajectory is not necessarily what's giving people the most amount of happiness. It might be giving them some security, but not necessarily happiness, fulfillment, and so on. So my view very strongly is that living a purposeful life is about living a happy life. I don't think that choosing to sort of not prioritize material acquisitions, for example, instead of prioritizing public service, is a choice of being unwealthy. I think wealthiness is about living a purposeful life, and I've seen that in many, many communities and people around the world, and I'm glad that I see it in many people in South Africa. Not necessarily in our leadership at the moment.
Yeah, but surely, Kumi, you must get to a stage where you go, now that pension pot, is it a pension pot that is one that can keep you sustained for the next 20, 30, 40 years, however long you might need it?
No, really, but it's not completely empty either. So in the sense of, obviously having not prioritized, sort of personal wealth accumulation, one does have a measure of insecurity, but one has to measure one's insecurity with that of others. And so in that sense, I feel it's not something that keeps me up at night.
It's an amazing sense
So
of peace that you can have, though, isn't it? I mean, because most people are stressing their gills out as to whether or not there will be enough and whether or not they'll be able to leave a legacy. And I mean, I suppose your legacy is in actions rather than in amounts of money.
I hope so, and I hope that the legacy is not just a family legacy, but it's community legacy, and that what one leaves is also ideas, programs, initiatives, inspiration for people to believe that the world around us that we live in cannot be the best world that humanity can create for itself, and that if we believe that collectively we can make things better, that's the only way things get better. And so and then thankfully that there's lots of people around the world since COVID have had a complete kind of calibration of values, really. I mean, I'm sure you've heard anecdotally of how many people have sort of given up the high-paying jobs and sort of sought out more purposeful lives. And so I'm not saying it's a majority by any means, but it's not a insignificant number either in different societies, where it kind of really forced us to think about what really matters. And at some point, how much is enough, is a question that we struggle with, right? And sadly, there's no blueprint on how much is enough to help people figure that one out, other than when people reach a position where they feel they have enough to meet their needs and that they can live with some measure of dignity.
Is the world
Hopefully,
on balance getting better, do you think, or not?
sadly, the answer to that is not right now, for the following reasons. One is we've just had a new climate report from the scientists, which basically are saying that we are, almost out of time before we hit the moment of irreversible runaway catastrophic climate change. And we are seeing the signs of it, sadly, in many parts of the world in terms of extreme spike and extreme weather events. So that's one trend that is really bringing quite a lot of security. Then the war in Ukraine is also having massive negative impacts globally, and international relations being strained, horrific human rights violations becoming normalized, and so on. And then we're also seeing a sort of shift to ultra-right thinking in terms of the rise of fascism, from the United States to Brazil to Hungary. We're seeing things that people used to, racist ideas that people used to articulate in private, now have been made normalized by the likes of Trump and others. So, and from an activist point of view and from a civil society point of view, we're also seeing significant closing up of political space. But here's where the optimism comes in. At one level, after more than 4.5 decades of activism, I can say that some of the challenges look significantly more scary in many ways. But on the other hand, the optimism comes in is I don't remember any other moment in history where people are willing to actually engage in activism that's about structural and systemic change, not simply about addressing the symptoms of the problem. So what kind of keeps me going is that actually in the moment we are, things have got to a point where it cannot be what Einstein warned us about when he said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. I think we are at the point now where people are willing to say, let's look at different ways of doing things, from a new energy system to a new agriculture system, and dare I say, to a new economic system as well.
Kumi Naidoo, activist and author, not kept awake at night by a smaller pension pot than many people would hope to have at his stage of life, but certainly believing that the impact of happiness and fulfillment over that sort of security, the joy of living a purposeful life, incredibly far more valuable. I love that sort of input on a Monday evening as we look at other people's money. This evening, the other person was Kumi Naidoo, the activist and author.
The Money Show.
Other people's money.